Hey, everybody, welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Man, do we have a really good show for you today, and a very unique one, as you're about to see here. The operational question we want to talk about today is: should the United States bomb Iran or not? Is that going to help our national security out? And there is no better person to talk about this than Colonel Doug Macgregor, friend of the show, who we have actually live on the phone from a business trip. He took some time out of his day right now, and we're so grateful for it to talk to us to go through this article here. And Doug, welcome to the show from where are you at? Florida, right?
Yeah, down in Orlando.
Oh, I was in Orlando last week. Well, that's good. Well, that's even more impressive that you're willing to take this time out there down in Orlando. We're very grateful to have you.
Sure.
Gary, if you can throw the picture of the article up there, Doug just published in the American Conservative: to bomb or not to bomb Iran. That is the question. Now, first of all, let me just ask you what prompted you to write this now, and obviously, a lot of people are advocating that we actually do that. We're going to play some of those clips here in a minute. But what prompted you to write this right now?
Well, for the last 30 years, we've had a steady drumbeat for war with Iran in Washington, D.C. And I think we've reached a point now where there is almost unanimous uh, agreement in Washington that the solution to all of the problems in the Middle East, particularly to the solution to Israel's national security issues, is to destroy Iran. I think it's lunacy. I don't think it's accurate. But I wanted to get people to understand that bombing itself is not a strategy, and target sets don't equate to a strategy. So if you don't have a strategic goal other than to destroy things, you're probably not going to accomplish anything, as we've seen in previous conflicts.
Now, along those lines, I think we have a great example here. I'm going to play one little clip here from Lindsey Graham, who's explaining why we should do exactly the opposite of what you suggest. Here's what he said.
Here's what we need to do. You need to hit something that Ayatollah values. His leadership team, like a Soleimani, or take him out of the oil business. If we hit their oil infrastructure, you don't need manned aircraft. They've got 4 refineries you can see from space. If you knock one of them out, they would stop this. If the goal is to deter Iran, you're failing miserably.
Well, I certainly agree with him on the last part that we are failing miserably to deter Iran, but I'm not sure that taking out their physical infrastructure, because I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, in your article, you state that's actually an act of war, not of deterrence.
Oh, of course, it's not going to persuade anybody to stop. It's going to do the opposite. Iran will simply go into an all out war footing. And we have hundreds of infrastructure targets across the region, populated with American soldiers, contractors, civilians. They will all be taken under precise missile fire, and we'll lose lots of American citizens. The other high probability is that they will attack Israel, and they have thousands of precision guided missiles that could utterly destroy Tel Aviv and Haifa. And I'm sure that that has crossed everybody's mind, and I would expect something like that to happen.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I recall, and I want to say it was 2019. There was some issues going on between, well, at that time, the Houthis and the Saudis were actually in an active war. And there was some cruise missiles which allegedly came from the Houthis, but I think was pretty clear it came from Iran, that had precise pinpoint targets on some of the Saudi infrastructure, their oil infrastructure, refinery facility, knocked like 5% of the global refinery offline for a period of time. And that one was defended by U.S. Patriot systems, and the missiles still got through. And as it turned out, that was a one-off. So it seemed like the Saudis changed their tune after that. But are you suggesting that even with Iron Dome, that potentially Israel could be attacked with those same capabilities?
Oh yes, Iron Dome is not designed to deal with a massive rocket and missile strike. They'll have some effect on mortar rounds and artillery rounds. They try to claim a very high rate of interception, but in reality, it's probably 50 to 60% if they're lucky. The kind of thing that would come at them from Iran will be far more lethal and massive. And you can overwhelm any air defense system with enough incoming missiles. So I think that's a foregone conclusion. Now I don't know that it's a certainty if if Israel carefully stays out of it. it depends on a lot of factors in the decision-making process in Iran. And given the way we act, the threats that we make, our tendency to bully people, the Iranians may conclude they have absolutely nothing to lose, in which case they'll unleash everything they've got.
Now, I wonder, I wonder how much pressure, external pressure Biden uses, or how much of an influence on Biden, external pressure from people like Lindsey Graham and also of Jack Keane. Jack Keane has, of course, been one of the biggest proponents of attacking Iran for a long time. And he added this, I believe it was earlier today.
We need a sustained campaign, not just to disrupt them, to stop them. And I think the campaign against the militias that are operating in Iraq and Syria is the same thing. We have to stop them from conducting these attacks. There's 165. We have to stop the attacks. That's got to be the objective.
So is Jack right? Is going after Iran, is that going to stop the attacks on our troops of these in all of these spots we have in Syria and Iraq?
No, what he fails to point out, and everyone who discusses this issue of whether or not to attack Iran, is that if you want these attacks against us and the Israelis to halt, President Biden merely needs to pick up the phone and call Israel and tell the Israelis to halt their operations in Gaza, because all of these attacks that he mentioned have happened after 7 October. The big mistake we can make is to assume, and I think there are people on the Hill that assume this, that somehow or another, these various militias suddenly decided, well, we're going to attack Americans and American shipping and Israeli shipping. That's not true. All of this has come about because of this campaign to expel or kill Arabs in Gaza. If that stops, then the attacks on us will stop. And of course, this is something that the Israelis don't want to stop. And apparently we've decided, despite what the International Court of Justice said, and what most people have concluded is a war crime, we've decided to continue supporting Israel and encourage the war crime.
And interestingly, on one of the Sunday shows yesterday, National Security Advisor Sullivan was pinned down to ask, are you thinking about actually attacking into Iran? Here's what he said.
Is the United States already in a wider war in the Middle East, Jake?
What the United States is doing is responding to threats as we see them with significant but proportionate force.
But has the war
we
expanded?
Are seeing threats
has the
to
war
shipping,
expanded in the region, Jake?
Well, first, we don't accept that what's happening in the Red Sea, for example, Kristen, is entirely tied to the war in Gaza, because the Houthis are attacking shipping that has absolutely nothing to do with Israel.
I think that's more of the delusion that they're not even tied to what's happening in Israel, because none of them started until November, which was a month after the attack there. So to say that is pretty disingenuous. And to be fair, a lot of these targets are not against Israeli targets specifically, because I don't know that they can identify them, but clearly they have an idea to jam up the Red Sea and to cause lots of economic problems for the West, so that they bring pressure on Israel. But any way you look at it, this is tied to that war.
Well, thus far, the Houthis have turned out to be pretty accurate in their selection of targets. They've allowed ships to go through that are not headed to Israel, that are not flagged for ownership by Israelis, that are not American flagged or owned by Americans, or for that matter, United Kingdom ships, in other words, British ships. If you are not affiliated with, supportive of, or allied with Israel, then your ship is allowed through. Now, when you start threatening ships, of course, Lloyd's of London, the principal insurance underwriter, essentially says, thank you very much. I'm not going to insure any ship that drives through there as long as there's a war on. That's a second and third order effect. But the notion that this has nothing to do with what's happening in Gaza is just a lie. And the man should be characterized as a liar, because he knows that. No one was attacking ships before the 7th of October.
Right.
Why are they attacking them now?
Exactly.
So either he thinks everyone is stupid or he's a fool.
Yeah, either way, it's not good, because the bottom line is we keep taking actions that are harmful and ironically, harmful to Israeli interest as much as to American interest. And all of these things, our troops are killed because of the reaction of the Arabs in the regime, which you keep making this directly connection between that. A lot of these Arabs that are making attacks against us are supported their fellow Arabs that are being killed in the
Yes.
Gaza Strip. So that is indirectly as it relates to Israeli policies and not to anything otherwise. And so to completely ignore that part of the equation and to try to stop it by bombing the other side is to ignore the motivation for these people to attack us in the first place.
Well, General Keane is also making a different point. He's arguing for bombing, I think, because he assumes, and with some degree of accuracy, that bombing will result in a wider war. And I think he and people like him, who are part of the war party, if you will, and they're all on the payroll, so to say, of various firms and financial institutions and organizations that urge war with Iran on behalf of Israel. He knows that he's creating conditions conducive to that wider war, and the objective is to get the United States into it. We've been down this road before. It's a very dangerous road to be on. We went down this road into Vietnam. And, we ought to reflect on the fact that how many years was it between 1991 and our invasion of Iraq in 2003 that we also bombed Iraq? I mean, we dropped more tonnage on Iraq in the 1990s, late 1990s, than had been dropped on Europe during the entire Second World War. What difference did that make? It changed absolutely nothing.
That is such a good point. I wanted to touch on something because you just mentioned it here, and it's also a major part of your article here about whether we should or shouldn't bomb Iran. And you draw some parallels to the way we got into the Vietnam War and the disasters with that. And I have this clip here from then LBJ President Johnson, and listen to his comments here because it sounds really familiar with things that you've heard in just the last few days here in the United States. Take a listen.
3 times in my lifetime, in 2 world wars and in Korea, Americans have gone to far lands to fight for freedom. We have learned at a terrible and a brutal cost that retreat does not bring safety, and weakness does not bring peace.
So what he chose to do was to accelerate American military power in the region to bring peace through the barrel of a gun, which didn't work out too well. And that's so hauntingly similar to what now, because so many people are saying, no, we can't withdraw our troops from Iraq and in Syria and get them out of the way so they're no longer targeted by these groups. We have to bring more power to bear because otherwise we'll be retreating and then all these vacuums will be created and all this other nonsense. But do you see any reason to think that argument is going to work this time when it didn't work in Vietnam or any of the other times it's been tried?
Well, of course not. And I think, again, that there are people like Jack Keane who are quite convinced that this will result in a total war between Iran and the United States. And he probably thinks that that's something that we can easily win. We thought so in Vietnam. We discovered that we were wrong. And we bombed and bombed and bombed long before we committed ground forces. And we continued to bomb throughout the war on the assumption that that would change behavior, that would have an impact on people's thinking. It didn't. The same thing is true right now. And I think it's fair to say that we are on a Vietnam-like path to war with Iran. The difference, of course, is that Iran is actually better prepared in many, many ways to take on our air power and naval power than Vietnam was. They've got an arsenal of thousands of missiles. Most of them are theater ballistic and tactical ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and unmanned systems that we call drones. It also now includes hypersonic missiles produced in China that have been sold to the Iranians. The hypersonic missile, as we've discovered, is virtually unstoppable, and it strikes with pinpoint accuracy. I would expect that all of our ships that are surface ships, certainly any aircraft that fly into the area, will be taken under fire. And their air defenses are not as good as the Russian air defenses today in eastern Ukraine, but they're still very good and they're still Russian in character. And I would expect them to exact a price from us if we try to fly through Iranian airspace, which ultimately I'm sure we will do.
Doug,
But at the
let me
same
ask you
time,
something.
the opportunity to strike back, this is what we don't seem to understand. There seems to be this view that war is one sided, that we bomb with impunity and nothing happens. Those days are over. And we haven't even discussed the very high probability that the Russians will do everything in their power to support Iran. They're certainly not going to let it be destroyed.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you something. Speaking of bombing, because it's something that you had a direct role in, and you have a viewpoint that almost nobody else has, and that is back in the Kosovo War, where we were bombing the Serbs
Right.
to try to get them to bend to our will. Now, I forget how long it was, like 80 days or whatever the number was of consecutive bombing. It appeared, and certainly many claimed in the end, that it was successful because it did get the political outcome. But I wonder if you can talk about what was actually going on there and how you saw that bombing campaign work.
Well, the bombing campaign lasted 78 days, and the bombing campaign did not compel Yugoslavia at the time, or Serbia as we call it today, to submit to our will. What happened was that about 5 weeks into the bombing, it became clear that the bombing was not going to produce the desired outcome. Remember, originally, General Wes Clark said that he thought it would last 3 to 5 days, at the most 2 weeks. Well, that rapidly fell apart. People underestimated the Serbian military power. They underestimated the staying power of the Serbian people and their air defenses, even though they were certainly anachronistic by the standards of the day compared with our own, were never degraded below 83%. And so we had a lot of losses that we reported as engine failure, engines that were shot to pieces over the Adriatic and pilots ditched. And in some cases, we did have aircraft that were shot down. One, of course, was a stealth fighter. So, I would argue that the campaign itself was a failure because targeting is not a strategy. You first you go in, you start bombing, and you don't get the effect you want. Well, then you say, I need more targets.
Right.
So you bomb more things, and you still don't get the effect that you want. And eventually, you bomb anything that stands still. If it's a bridge, you bomb it. If it's a building, you bomb it. If it's a factory, even though it may have no military utility or application whatsoever, you bomb it. In other words, you run out of any sort of rationale because it never made sense to begin with. That's essentially what happened. And when it
Yeah,
became,
and
and
that,
what happened, and this is important for your audience to understand this, Milosevic received a note from Moscow where Strobe Talbot had gone to Moscow to negotiate directly with the Russians to abandon their Serbian friends. And ultimately, I suspect we, you know, bribed them with billions of dollars and help and support that we probably never delivered. But we managed to convince the Russians to let the Serbs know that they could not sustain Serbia with fuel and food through the winter. When it became clear that there would be no extra fuel and food from Russia, that's when Milosevic met with his senior leadership and said, we've got to call it quits because we don't want to go through the winter without any heat and without any food and risk the starvation and deaths of hundreds of thousands of Serbs. So as a
yeah.
result, that's what threw in the towel. But I think that's what we're up against here with Iran is something very similar, only the Russians are not going to give up and walk away, and neither will the Chinese.
Yeah, and I think what you say really rings so makes the comments of like both Keene and Lindsey Graham that we just played ring so hollow because Graham is famous and he said it in that clip there that we need to hit Iran like this and then they'll get it and back down. He never stops to think, what if they don't? What if they actually have already calculated how much they can lose and they know they're going to lose something against us and they continue to absorb these shots and they don't back down and they do start launching missiles. Keene and both Keene and Graham give no thought to that, nor any of these other people who think that that's going to be a panacea. So I wonder if in the last amount of time you have here, Doug, if you can say, what do you think we should be doing? What should the Biden administration do to protect our troops and to stop these attacks?
Well, getting our forces out of the region, our ground forces, these little penny packets of thousands of infantrymen that are spread out across parts of Syria or Iraq is something that's long overdue. Donald Trump wanted to remove all those forces from Syria and Iraq back in 2020, tried it initially in 2019, and people on the ground lied to him and told him they were leaving when they weren't. And then when he found out that he'd been lied to, unfortunately, he did not take decisive action to punish people for lying to him and failing to obey his orders. That should have happened. But right now, the best thing that we can do is for President Biden to call Netanyahu and said, that's it. We're pulling the plug. Either you stop what you're doing in Gaza or we withdraw our military support from you. And all of the Israeli general officers retired that have spoken publicly have all said that the Israelis couldn't operate for more than a few days without the massive influx of American military equipment, munitions, advice, support, and so forth. So that's the number one thing. Number two, we absolutely need to get out of Syria and Iraq. There's no reason for us to be there. This nonsense about ISIS is untrue. The war with ISIS was over a long time ago. They're there as tripwires to do exactly what they're doing, drag us into a war with Iran. And that's why they've been left there, supposedly to stop Iranian influence. Well, if that's the case, by November of 2003, Iran had largely taken over events and controlled events in Iraq. So we lost the initiative in Iraq very, very early. So the notion that we're there to stop that is absurd. So that, this is the tripwire. This is what people want. And again, I'm afraid that just as we saw in the 1960s, our objective was to get the United States Armed Forces, particularly the Army, into Vietnam. Let's just get them in there and we'll muddle through. And as I mentioned to someone recently, that I was told that Wolfowitz made exactly the same comment in the spring of 2003 to Rumsfeld. He said, look, we just want to get the U.S. Army into Iraq. Let's just get them in there. Once they're in there, we'll sort this out. That doesn't work. It never has. You don't sort something out when you're halfway up to your ears in a major war. You have to have clear, attainable political military objectives. You have to have a method to get there, and you have to have a vision of what you want to see happen in the future. Yeah. If your vision is Iran is destroyed and there's nothing left, that's not a vision. That's a death wish, because the world is not going to stand around and put up with that. Russia won't put up with it. I don't even think the Turks will put up with it. And the Turks are rivals. And the Iranians and the Turks have been talking quite a bit lately.
Yeah. All these directions are not going in good ways for us. What happens in your view? You said there's two things that we could do that could really protect us. Get our troops out of the Middle East, Iraq and Syria in particular, and basically tell Netanyahu that there's no more free ride here. They either do what we say or we pull the plug. What if Biden does neither of those things, but continues to try to protect us with firepower? What do you see happening in the coming, say, couple of months?
Well, there will be more attacks. In fact, I would expect them quite soon. But these, of course, will be attacks by the militias. And again, the argument that these Arab militias have no agency, in other words, they have no independence, is nonsense. They may have received training and material assistance from Iran, but they are independent. And the key point to remember is that Hezbollah, the elements we're talking about in Iraq, are mostly Shiite, and the Houthis are Shiite, but they are all Arabs. And they see in themselves as being in solidarity with the Arabs in Gaza, who are being killed or driven out of the country, as well as with Hamas. So at the end of the day, they're going to do what they've been doing in the past. They'll just continue to do it. The issue is, if we strike targets in Iran, we will be at war with Iran. And that's an entirely new situation. All the bets are off. Stop talking about militias, because the militias, whatever they are minuscule in terms of the combat power that Iran can produce.
Yeah, that's what I fear that's what I was afraid you would say, because that's certainly the way it looks. Because whether it's Sullivan, whether it's Secretary of State Blinken or Austin or President Biden himself, none of them seem to have any vision or any possibility of ever telling Israel no, and they don't seem to have any path in the greater Middle East except for use more missiles and hope that we can bomb our way to peace. And so basically with that, it's just hard for me to see how this ends any way good. And
Well, remember
it's very discouraging.
Dan, remember one last point here. Johnson was under tremendous pressure to involve us in Vietnam. It started with bombings and advisors, as you know, in 1964. Then we finally committed ground forces. But one of the things that he was accused of, because he was from the left, he was a Democrat, was potentially being soft on communism. Johnson soft on communism. He won't take the action that's required. That was the Republican, battle cry, if you will. Johnson's weak. Well, right now you've got a similar battle cry on the Hill. Biden is weak. Biden won't stand up and show Iran just how powerful we are. This is the sort of nonsense that traps presidents, particularly weak presidents. Johnson was weak. This man is weak. He's easily pushed into things. And that's what I think will happen. I think he's ultimately going to succumb to the pressure and he will bomb Iran.
That's unfortunately kind of where that's the trend that we're going on, and that's what it seems. And I just pray to God some miracle happens that we don't, because if short of a miracle, I'm afraid that is where we're heading. Well, listen, Doug, we are so grateful for your time. Thanks so much for pulling some time out of your business travels there. We're very grateful for it, and we look forward to having you back on next week. Where we're going to see what happens with these things in between now and then.
Sure. Thanks very much, Dan.